Karakoto. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. So I'm just going to jump right into it. I only have half an hour, which is a bit more than I thought I would have. But anyway, so let's paint a scenario, right? Let's imagine you're on a first date with someone. Everything is going really well. You're talking, you're making small talk. You're figuring out each other's likes and dislikes. And then, you ask like the inevitable, like the question that always comes out. I like playing video games. What kind of video games do you like playing? And then they would say like, oh, I don't know, something really awesome, like, Breath of the Wild, Baldur's Gate 3, amazing storylines, like amazing character development. And you're like, okay, what about you? What kind of games do you like? And then, you kind of look at it and like, Valorant. For the story. So my point with this is that different people like playing different kinds of video games. I know I'm preaching to the choir here. I think a lot of you would probably know, like, your game devs, your audiences really well. And like, the person who plays like a big MMORPG is not going to be playing Valorant. Maybe they might be, I don't know. But they might not play like, a city builder or like some kind of other simulation games. Like, people have different reasons and different motivations for playing video games. And so this is something that, like, I'm sure all of you are very familiar with. This is Richard Bartle's taxonomy of player types. I forgot who mentioned this earlier. I think it was Chelsea that mentioned it earlier. So this is like really early on, back in the day in '96, which I think was like barely a couple of years after the MMORPG genre was invented. So kind of with this model, you have like 4 player types, which is kind of cool. It's a cool way to think about it, but there are limitations with this model. First of all, it's based on MMORPGs, so it might not necessarily transcend genre. It's also not scientifically tested. It's not validated, well, at least to a high rigorous level. But beyond that, there are some issues here that I think don't quite explain the whole picture. So I'm not, if you like this model, I'm not picking a fight with you. You're welcome to use it if you want to use it. I'm just explaining to you like my kind of reservations with this and some potential alternatives. So the first thing is, with this model, you are getting 4 player types on 2 dimensions. And there are 2 problems with this. The first one is these dimensions are assumed to be bidirectional. So that means that if you go this way, your preference is to other players, and if you go this way, your preference is to the world. Now, if you think about it, that's not mutually exclusive. You could enjoy playing an MMORPG game because of the PvE elements, but you could also enjoy elements that are PvP. And in the same way, it doesn't mean that if you're interacting, that is the direct opposite of acting, which I'm honestly not quite sure how to define this. But anyway, the 2 dimensions itself is a problem because you could be high on both. And in this case, what would happen if you're high on both? You just get drawn in right back to the middle, which is exactly the same as someone who doesn't like both as well. The other problem with this is that let's say if you are an achiever, you're like, high world orientation, high acting orientation, you're somewhere here. But if you're like 50.1% world, 50.1% acting, you're also here. But, you're both grouped into achievers, this achiever like construct, and that's not necessarily comprehensive enough to kind of like, basically my point is they're not the same player. They might have differences, or you might be like, you're really high in world and really high in like players as well, and you like killing other players as well. But you also like exploring, and then you have like 2 different kind of things here. By the way, this is the same problem with the Myers-Briggs construct, where you're like, oh, I'm an INFP, I'm an ESTJ, but you could be both. So anyway, so what do psychologists use when we want to talk about this sort of game preferences? Well, the big one, the really expensive one, would be Quantic Foundry and what Nick Yee is doing. Some really cool stuff here. So he has a lot more scientific rigor in the way that he develops these dimensions, and it's pretty cool to look at. Like, it's definitely data-driven. It's based on very powerful statistical techniques. But it's also behind a paywall where you have to pay like thousands of dollars to access. So I don't use this one. I use the free version of it called like the player trait skill. And so this is cool because this is based on a very commonly used psychological alternative to the Myers-Briggs that we call like the Big Five personality construct. What does that mean? Okay, so I'm going to break down a few examples for you. So let's say some of these similarities and constructs overlap quite a bit. So let's say if you're someone who's very high in openness. So openness would be you are someone who's open to new experiences. You're someone who's open to trying new things. You might go bungee jumping. So what they found was that people high in this, so this is research by Gustavo Tondello back in 2019. So what they found was that people high in openness would also be high in aesthetic orientation, which means you play games to explore worlds. So for example, like, looking at the scenery and feeling awe at some of these landscapes. For social aspects and extroversion, so extroversion is, personality, like I love talking to other people and being the life of the party. You're also more likely to play games for social reasons, like to interact with other people. Big asterisk here is there's some caveats to this. Maybe if I have time, I'll get into it. And also, if I forget, remind me, because like Minecraft is really cool, and I might come back to Minecraft if we have time at the end of this. Okay, so what we found out is that, so kind of going back here, where's that? Okay, back here, back. You're right. Is that these kinds of player type constructs, player traits, and personality types are linked. But personality is not the only way that people are different from each other, as you can expect. And so one of the things that my lab and I have been very curious about, and have been really wanting to get into, is the idea of video games and mental health. I think, I'll come to that later. So this study was some research that we've done quite recently. We looked at data from about 3,000 Kiwis, 3,000 New Zealand residents, over a 10-year period. So this is not specific to video games. This was like a very large-scale, general survey on like attitudes, well-being, a variety of facets. But there was one question in particular asking participants, like, in the past week, how many hours do you spend playing video games a week? And so we just used some computational methods on this. We clustered the data. We tried to look at it to see if we could find any kind of patterns. And we found, basically two major types of people for this specific question about video game play. So the first one, the majority of participants, over the course of 10 years, they didn't really play much video games. This was like an average of 0 hours per week, maybe 1 hour a week. So I call them like casual gamers or non-gamers. But there was another sort of group of people that play an average of like 10 to 20 hours a week. And so I call them like frequent and excessive gamers. Now, this is not exactly true. It's not really excessive gaming, because if you look at definitions of like internet gaming disorders, of like problematic gaming, we're talking about 35 to 40 hours a week worth of gaming. So this is far below the threshold to be considered, a problem. But even then, when we looked at some of the difference in their sort of constructs, or the difference in some of the ways that they think, specifically for mental health, we found that gamers were constantly scoring lower on indices of mental health. So basically, poor mental health, higher psychological distress, and just lower well-being overall. Now, this is interesting because, like, this research alone doesn't show causality. We're not saying that if you play more video games, you're going to have a worse mental health. It's not as simple as that relationship. If anything, it points to the opposite, where as we probably have intuition about, sometimes if you don't have a great mental health, like if you don't fit in with your classmates in school, if you don't fit in with society, sometimes you go to play Minecraft or you play like MMORPGs and you find your community, your sense of belonging, as Sean mentioned earlier. So anyway, so this could be like a way of coping with poor mental health. But there are bigger questions here and there are bigger things that are going on here. And so we decided to look at this relationship between mental health and well, just video game preferences a little bit more. And so the results I'm going to be talking about are still very much research in progress. Like these are my master's student theses that are not completely completed yet, so it's still very early information, but I'll just get right to it. So anyway, coming back to the player traits, I use this a lot because it's free. I would use other models, but I don't want to pay like thousands of dollars a year. So anyway, fantastic models. And so we looked at, rather than personality, which was already done, we looked at player traits, and we looked at psychopathology. By psychopathology, I mean things like depression, anxiety, and stress. Very simple stuff. I did not look at some other aspects of neurodiversity like ADHD or autism. Those are fantastic questions to ask. They were just not in the scope of the surveys that we did. And just to summarize some of the results that we got, we found that depending on the kind of psychopathology that you have, the kind of games that, the kind of player traits that they would have would be slightly different. The big finding that we got was between depression and challenge. So challenge would be things like, I don't know, playing Jump King, or playing like a game that, you know, you try to, a really difficult game that you try to defeat, or like, you know, speed running, so playing a game because you want to speed run it. So those would fall under like the kind of challenge categorization. So we found that people who scored higher on depression also scored lower on this challenge motivation, which meant that if you were more depressed, you were less likely to play difficult games or to play challenging games as a kind of trait level preference. And not just depression, we also found a similar result for stress as well. Like the more likely you are stressed with your everyday life, the less likely you are to play challenging video games. Now this is entirely intuitive, right, if you think about it, because we know that with depression, one of the things about depression is that with depression in general, you have a lack of motivation to do anything. So that also extends to video games. So one guideline here is that if you're trying to make a game for mental health purposes, you know, try not to make it too difficult because that is not the audience that you're going for. Same thing with stress. Stress, I think, we're still just barely getting to look into it. I think it's a different mechanism from depression. But the thing about stress is, if you think about, so this is entirely my thoughts, right? I have no data to back this up. I have some research papers that might talk about it. But how many of you are familiar with like the isekai genre of anime? Or even not just anime, of like, of Royal Road, basically, like the idea of an OP protagonist. Now, who are the target audiences of these kinds of genres? Usually, working adults who are stressed with their lives, people like me. And it makes a lot of sense, right? If you're stressed, one of the ways you want to play video games is to distract yourself, is to escape from these kinds of environments. But surprisingly, we didn't find that relationship, and this is why it's not on the slides. We actually looked at things like positive distraction, which is a way of regulating emotions, and we just didn't find any result between stress and using games for these kind of distractive purposes. So I feel like we're onto something, but we're not quite sure what we're finding here. And it's something that we really need to look into a little bit more. Okay, so the other thing, if you remember, I talked about depression, stress, and anxiety. And anxiety, we didn't see any result. And this is interesting because I think Sean talked about social anxiety earlier, and I completely agree with that. If you look at the literature, there's examples of people with social anxiety finding their communities online. So if you're sort of, stressed and worried about interacting in offline environments, this kind of anonymity in online spaces gives you like this cover that you can therefore interact more freely. And this is something that we also hypothesized and was found qualitatively with research on hikikomoris, which is Japanese people who withdraw from society. And this was some of the theories that were laid out. But interestingly, I don't have it on the slides, but when we actually surveyed Japanese people with hikikomori sort of conditions, we found the opposite effect, where if you were more hikikomori, you were actually less likely to play games for social purposes. So this is like this gigantic question mark here that like, we see theory going all different kinds of directions, and we just need to figure out what's going on here. And so one of my fantastic master's students, Tal Dimond, he decided to scrape the entire, well, not the entire, scrape as much of the social anxiety subreddit as he could, paying attention to posts that mention the word games as a keyword. And we basically found like opposing results. Like one of the things was scaffolding. So games are scaffolding in environments. I guess it's similar to what Sean mentioned earlier with TTRPGs, where because like if you have social anxiety, you're not familiar with interacting with people in real life. So games are basically, like MMORPGs are basically this protected environment where you can experiment. You can try out different things. You can forge and form your identities. But it goes both ways, because what we found through this qualitative survey was that it helped for some people. Like if they found supportive communities, they were able to sort of overcome or improve on their conditions. But if they found like negative pushback, like toxic communities, that ended up like making their social anxiety worse. And so it doesn't work for everybody. But my point here with all of this research that I've done is that I have no idea what's going on. And we need to get to the bottom of this. And therefore, that basically comes to the main point of my talk, which is video games are ubiquitous. Like 80% of people play video games. And I think yesterday Piper mentioned like 90% of people with neurodivergent individuals play video games. And so we know so far that mental health is linked to video game preferences and to video game motivations. And so we see a variety of different things. Sometimes it could be like a feedback loop. It's not so simple to say like one causes the other, because, for example, if you're coping with depression by playing MMORPGs, but at the same time, constantly being in an MMORPG makes you less likely to interact with your with your family, for example, and that might worsen relationships, and that feeds back again into depression. And so it's not as simple as saying like one leads to the other. It's a lot more complex than that. But my point is we don't know a lot of things, and the methods that I'm using here are just surveys, interviews, scraping Reddit, and so these are very much retrospective. Like these are asking people on their opinions, their thoughts, and sometimes they don't know themselves very well. I mean, we don't know, I don't know myself very well. So we definitely need to observe players. We need to figure out what's going on in games as they happen in real time. And so coming to the title of my talk, which is, how can we work together? Like, how can psychologists like Sean and I work together with game devs like you to sort of address this and to look at the overall mental health of our gamer communities a bit better. And so I'm gonna try and propose, and hopefully you buy into this with me, 3 levels or 3 kinds of collaboration. The first one would just be, let us look at your data. And so psychologists, as part of our training, we have extensive statistical experience. We have to go through like, nowadays, we have to go through computational methods training, so we are familiar with things like machine learning, with big data analysis. We know how to do like regressions and statistics. Let us look at your data for you, and let us try and see like the same issues that you might run into with playtesting, or beta testing. You might be looking for bugs. You might be looking for how your players are playing your game. And we want to know that as well, because that helps us identify not just the players who are playing your game, but like what kinds of players are playing your game. Are you reaching your intended audiences? And in this case, are we looking at, can we tell the mental health of the gamers that are playing your game? And is there any kind of relationship there? For example, maybe people with depression might be making choice A, B, and C, but people with stress might be making choice B, C, D, and E. That kind of thing. Like we want to know that, and by looking at your data, that could help. Now, I know this is a big step for a lot of you, because sharing protected data might not be something that comes by very easily, but I think this is an area that if we can join forces, that could be one area of collaboration. The other thing I mentioned was playtesting, right? And this is something that I think we could work a lot better together, we could help you with. So as psychologists, I think I speak for everyone who's psychology trained, is that we know how to build experiments. We know how to do human experimentation and human testing. But that also means, like what Sean mentioned, we know how to put people into a room and ask them to play video games and ask them afterwards, how was the video game? Did you enjoy yourself? And so we know how to do that, and we want to maybe help you with that, because at the same time, helping you get data on how people are playing your game, we can also figure out, we can apply the theories that we know, we can apply theories of psychopathology or personality to try and figure out a little bit deeper how different sort of player profiles are playing your game differently. And that's interesting for us as psychologists to understand how people in general play games differently. And this is the last kind of collaboration that I would like to propose. And this is, to me, like the holy grail. Yeah, grail. Anyway, the holy grail, which is co-design. Co-design is this big thing in human-computer interaction. If you do design, you might have come across this term before. And it's basically like working with subject matter experts, is working with clients or with stakeholders to try and build a product that would appeal to that intended audience. So in this case, if you treat like us as part of the co-design process, psychologists as part of the co-design process, I think it would be interesting to see like how we could tie in some of our theories to your game. I mean, we know how people think and how, well, we don't actually know how people think, but we like to think we know how people feel and how people think. And so we might be able to sort of guide or, have some input into some of the structures or some of the, maybe the pivotal moments of your narrative or like some of kind of the decisions that your players might go. You might be able to help there. And if you're interested especially in making games for mental health, I think this is a great place to collaborate because we can just guide you, or well, not guide, but we're more familiar with like cognitive behavioral therapy or different kinds of like therapeutic methods that we could maybe weave into your game. So as like Sean mentioned earlier, I shared his sort of pain, I guess, where if you just let psychologists make games by themselves, they tend to be very boring, and they tend to be a bit too rigid and too focused on the actual therapy. But I think there's a lot of room for experimentation and sort of weaving it together to form, a more compelling product. And I think a very good example of this would be, that's not the right, would be Spiritfarer. I'm not sure if any of you have come across this game before, but for me, this was proof that you can actually make a very compelling, psychologically enriched game. For those of you who don't know, this game deals a lot with the topics of death, dying, and grief and bereavement. And personally, it was like something that I also really resonated with. And apparently, there is a lot of research that has gone on, like looking at Steam reviews, looking at interviews of players to show that it has reached the intended audiences. It has helped people cope with the grief and their bereavement. And so to me, this is just a fantastic example of how co-design can work really, really well. So to sum everything up, we want to help you make better games because I think there's a whole process. Oh wait, I didn't talk about Minecraft. Can I still talk about Minecraft? All right, so I don't have a slide here because this came out to me as Sean was talking, and I thought maybe I should just talk about a bit of what big projects we're doing now. So being a gamer, so I managed to borrow like university servers back in Canterbury, and I convinced them. Is that the right word to use? I managed to I managed to ask them really nicely to host a Minecraft server on university computers. So I guess they could have been curing cancer, and that would have been great. But now they're used to play Minecraft, whatever, right? So we have a game server going on that we're trying to get people to use and play. And so we want to try and encourage people to like make games on Minecraft, mini games on Minecraft, because this is one way for us to use mods, to use plugins to analyze and visualize player data to try and do proof of concepts that we can actually work together on this, short of actually making our own game. So anyway, that's some things I'm working on with my lab right now. So yeah, coming back to this last slide here, making better games with psychologists. So at the end of the day, I guess it's slightly different from researcher to researcher, but what my group and I are interested in is we want to know what is it about video games that make people behave the way they do, feel the way they do, like social processes, what makes people have sense of belonging to video game, and how does that in turn affect your everyday well-being in your life? We've heard so many stories just anecdotally of how video games have changed our perception and changed our whole worldview. I mean, you're probably here considering a career in video games because you have been touched by a video game like I was. So like, what is the process that's going on? What can we tell? And we really need more data and more like structured methodology into these kinds of areas. And I'm trying to pitch this out here to see if anyone wants to come talk to me about this later on, please. So thank you very much for coming to this talk. I realized I didn't introduce myself. Hi, my name is Kong. I'm a lecturer at the University of Canterbury, and I lead the digital culture research group. It's a very new group, but we basically do research in video games and social media. And I want to just thank my collaborators as well who have helped me with the research presented here. Okay, how are we on time? Okay, all right, I see it. I see the sign. Thank you very much.